Taylor. I'm the Executive Director of the Newport Historical Society, and I'm here just to introduce Dr. Iris de Rhode, who is giving the second talk in what we hope will not be the last, on some of her new and original research, bringing stories of the French occupation of Newport to light, either brand new stories or great new information and new perspectives with which to view this important story. And with that, Iris, take it away.
Thank you very much, Ruth, for this introduction and for organizing this lecture. And also, so of course, Newport is an important place for me, specifically for the research I'm doing, because it was such an important place for the French soldiers and officers that stayed there for about 11 months in the years of 1780 and 81. So what I want to address today is specifically what the French testimonies can tell us about, you could say, those who were forgotten in a lot of narratives on the American Revolution. And of course, recently, and especially in the last maybe 3 to 4 decades, there's more and more research done on the role of African Americans, Native Americans, but also women that were, of course, important in the efforts of the Continental Army, the French Army, the British Army as well, to achieve the American independence. And their stories have often never been heard. They've been erased, we could say, out of history, or at least they never have really gotten the place they should have been having. There are multiple reasons for this, which I will address later too, but what the main point I want to show you today is that actually through French testimonies, we can reconstruct a little part of that story, not at all the entire story, but at least the French perspective can give us some insights to the numbers of African-American soldiers, the efforts of Native Americans, and also a little bit about the women. And so what I'll focus on today is also, of course, on Newport, since we're part of this Newport Historical Society lecture series. And so the French, being in Newport for a long time, have left testimonies on that. And that's how we can reconstruct that part of the story of the American Revolution. So that's what I'll do today. So I wanted to start by just making you aware of a few things by looking at the most famous paintings that we all have seen already a few times, of course. They're the most important. Let's say this is, of course, the surrender of Cornwallis, where you can see the French and American armies, and of course, the surrender of the British Cornwallis at Yorktown. But so if you look well, what you notice is that there is only white men on this painting. Same goes, of course, for some other very famous paintings of the American Revolution and its origins, where there's only white men in the paintings. And of course, they played an important role, and also the white officers, soldiers, and everyone involved. But of course, there's much more to tell about this story. And unfortunately, for a very long time, and especially throughout the later part of the 18th century and mainly the 19th century, the national narrative on the American Revolution has left out many people that have participated in the war. And I'll address a little bit more maybe why that is, but let's focus on a few paintings that you also know, but you might never have noticed that actually, for instance, here on the Washington's crossing of the Delaware, there is an African-American soldier on the ship, as you can see on the painting. And so here you can see several other portraits where actually you can also see that at least African Americans are present in these paintings, showing that, of course, it was very common at the time. Here's another painting where you can see Rochambeau and Washington at Yorktown, and you can see very vaguely, but still in the background, that there are some African Americans apparently participating in the battle. And these are less famous, but still to show you that, of course, women also played their different roles. And so by looking at these works of art, we can wonder about these forgotten patriots, we can call them. So the African Americans, free and enslaved, Native Americans, and the females participating as actual patriots in the Continental War effort, Continental's Army war effort. And so what I will not do today is discuss other parts, which is, of course, the British Army that actually had also a lot of African-American soldiers. But we have to focus on something, because I don't have that much time, of course, in one lecture. But we should not forget, of course, that the British forces had a lot of African Americans and Native Americans, and of course also women around their army, that were also very important for the whole story of the American Revolution. But what I'll do today is really focus on the patriot side, let's say, which of course includes also the French army. And so the reason that some of these, let's say, forgotten heroes have been forgotten is mainly the national narrative of the American nation, that throughout the 19th century, of course, became larger and larger and needed their own narrative. And unfortunately, African Americans fell aside of that story, mainly, of course, because of the very important, well, racial discrimination, but also segregation, and the story written by a few people that were mainly focusing on, for instance, the role of the founding fathers and not of the others. Native Americans is the same situation, and women, of course, were not serving actively as soldiers, but they did play sort of more secondary behind the screen role that is also important for the effort. And so without going really long into historiography, we can see that up until the 1960s, these three groups, and specifically African Americans and Native Americans, have really been written out of history because some other, let's say, heroes took over the story, and these others were not fitting in that narrative. So another reason why they're left out of history is because there's a real lack of sources. The sources relating to the American Revolution come, of course, from a lot of primary material, so being the journals of the soldiers and officers, mainly officers, of course, that were participating in the American War of Independence. So we're talking here about American officers, but also French officers. And of course, there's lots of other material, such as enlistment rolls, or for instance, when payments were made, when people were enlisting, they would write down certain elements, but often details that would give us clues in order to understand if they were mainly, or if they were African Americans or Native Americans, or if they were maybe American or European descent. These things were often left out of the records. And so it means that as a historian, it's very complicated to reconstruct the exact stories of these participants to the war effort. However, there's a few clues. I'm not saying that there is a lot, unfortunately. I have been digging quite a lot into lots of French documents, and there is, in, for instance, a whole journal, you can find 4 references to one of the 3 groups I just mentioned. But still, the French are, what's very interesting about them, of course, participants of the war, but they're also observers of America. So what happens is that a lot of young, mainly officers in the French army, that of course is arriving in 1780 in Newport, in July of 1780 in Newport, when they arrive, they start to observe where they are. So you have to imagine, as a traveler, even as today, if you go to a new land, new country, you're visiting, for instance, on holidays, you are noticing differences with your own country. You're noticing new things. You're noticing things that are not very maybe logical to you, or that are very different from what you're used to. And so what you do is you describe these things that are noteworthy in your own observations. And this is exactly what the French are doing. And so they write down much more than the average American officer that has been living in these surroundings and that has been used to many things that have happened or that he has seen. And so some things are not necessarily, let's say, noteworthy of writing down for certain people serving in the Continental Army, but for those that are arriving in this new land, there's a lot to observe. And this is why the French journals and some of their correspondences are very useful as a source for historians to reconstruct these unknown stories of the American Revolution that really deserve to be told. And so these observers of America, you can see a few of them here, left their testimonies. Again, there's not like a book that describes everything from the time period, but by getting a few sentences here and there, you can learn quite a lot about a few things that are not to be found in the American accounts. And so that's what I'll do today. And what's interesting to start with maybe is that I already mentioned that in the sort of more national narrative of the American Revolution, a few people have been left out. And you can already see that in the actual, during the time of the revolution, or just after 1785, where Jefferson writes to Chastellux, this is quite a famous letter. So Chastellux is a major general under Rochambeau, serving in the expeditionary army during the American Revolution. And so Jefferson and him become friends during this specific time period of the revolution, and they continue writing to each other. And so Jefferson says something that I think is quite crucial for our understanding of this lack of source material, and maybe also the lack of Americans commenting on certain elements of the Continental Army and the war effort, mainly relating to enslaved. Because as you can see here on this quote, he says that the strictures on slavery and on the Constitution of Virginia are the parts which I do not wish to have made public. So he's here writing about a book that he's going to publish. I can explain more if you want to, but so he's writing this to Chastellux, saying that it will maybe cause harm, or it might do good, or he doesn't know that, the publication of his ideas on slavery. And specifically, he says, it's possible that in my own country, the strictures might produce an irritation which would indispose the people towards the two great objects I have in view. That is the emancipation of their slaves and the settlement of their constitution. And then he said, every young man at the college, it is to them I look, to the rising generation, and not the one now in power for these great reformations. So this whole question of slavery during the revolution and just after is very controversial. As we know, it split the United States in a later stage of their history, but also to make a union, this question of slavery was very complicated to discuss, as there were so many diverging opinions on them. And so he says in this letter, Jefferson, in sort of a private letter, where he says it's to the rising generation, so it's after us that people have to really deal with this. And this is quite telling for the period, but also for the mentality of many people, and lots of debates today still on, is the revolution something that was achieved or is it still ongoing? Some of the main principles, like people are created equal, is that actually achieved during the War of Independence or not at all? These bigger questions are, of course, very important to ask. I don't know if you're still, yes. Sorry, I don't know what happened there. Something happened in the PowerPoint. Anyway, and so these are interesting explanations to understand why there's a lack of sometimes also source material, and maybe the published journals of those serving in the Continental Army might have had parts on slavery or on African-American soldiers that might have been left out in their published versions. It would be interesting to look at that. I don't know if that's really true, but I would assume that a few people have just decided not to talk about it, as for the reason of Jefferson's ideas himself. Okay, so if now we go back to the French, because as I already said, there's a lack of sources to the forgotten heroes of the American Revolution, but there are clues in the French testimonies. And so just as a little reminder, the French arrive in Newport in July 1780, and they stay there up until June 1781. And that will, of course, be the moment that they leave afterwards to go to their long march to New York and then to Yorktown. And so in this period, they some of them write journals. So every day they take notes of what they see, what they do. And some of them actually go to sort of expeditions around Newport and even to the other states to observe what's going on in America. They do this out of their own curiosity, but way more importantly, they do this because they need to understand where they are. They need to understand who they're fighting with. They need to understand what they're going to fight, who they're going to fight against, how the lands are, how the geography is laid out, all these different things, of course, officers need to understand to conduct a war. And so in these observations that they write, and that they at the end also publish, their memoirs often are published later on, by the way, in their lives. But so what they do is they collect information and they make observations. And these observations are telling us, of course, a lot about logistics and about the war itself, but they especially tell us a lot about these other groups. And so I'll start with Rochambeau himself, who writes in his actual journal that is published way later. So he rewrites it, but he says they have, so he's talking here about the Continental Army, they have in some of their regiments companies of Negroes, but they are always commanded by whites. So just a side note, the word Negro is a period, in the time period it's used as a term, and I'm just quoting it without any, I don't want to say that word obviously, but it's a quote from the 18th century. And so they have these companies in some of their regiments. So it's not just one regiment. Apparently there are several regiments that actually have Black soldiers fighting in them. And so he says, but they're always commanded by whites. So we'll have a closer look to what that really means. There's also one account, and this is a Hessian officer, being a German speaking person, but he was serving in the French army as well, who said, the Negro can take the fields of his master, and therefore no regiment is to be seen in which there are no Negroes in abundance, and among them are able-bodied and strong fellows. So this is another testimony already before, by the way, the French arrived, but he says here that indeed the sort of enslaved or freed can take the field of the masters. And that means that during the enlistment period, sometimes there were a few states. So just to go back to how that worked, the Continental Army was, of course, a Continental Army, and you had the state militias. And per state, the recruitment process was happening. And in some of the states, enlistment was mandatory for certain people. And so instead of going yourself themselves as a master, they could send their enslaved instead of themselves. And so this led to a lot of African Americans being enlisted. This is one of the reasons why they could do that. So going back to the regiments we're talking about today, because I want to focus, as I already said, mainly on Newport. So that we're talking there specifically about the 1st Rhode Island Regiment, because that's also the first regiment that the French encounter being in Newport. But there's more, actually, Black troops of the American Revolution being also. So the 1st Rhode Island Regiment is mainly Black, and then the Bucks of America, it's called, the militia of Massachusetts, had also a big Black unit with actually a Black officer, which was, or at least what I've understood, the only one that was actually the only African American that actually became an officer. And then there's also the 4th Connecticut Regiment, also an all-Black regiment. And then there's the French army that during the campaign of De Grasse, so that is later on in Yorktown, there's a whole unit being the volunteers of Saint-Domingue, Santo Domingo, being Haiti, with also a lot of Black soldiers serving in them. So these are the regiments where there's an let's say, representation, or even all Black regiments within the Continental Army. And the 1st Rhode Island Regiment is quite well known, but others are at least quite forgotten, or at least what I have seen in that. But the 1st Rhode Island Regiment has received quite some recent interest, at least, and people are doing more and more research to really understand. But what I'm saying, there is a lack of sources, but it's still quite possible to reconstruct the stories and how that all functioned. And then, of course, regiments and militia of Virginia, New Jersey, New Hampshire, Maryland, New York, all these also had African Americans fighting in their midst. And so Robert Seelig, who is, I think, here, but I can't really see that now, but he has done a lot of research on this. So this list I got from his article that he wrote about this subject. And so within the French, because you might wonder, so there is the French observe some of the regiments already when they arrive, and I'll give you quite some quotes just after this, but just to have some context, you might also wonder, what about the French army themselves? Did they have African Americans or, well, that's not really, of course, I mean, Africans fighting in the French army? And the answer is yes. So during the 17th century already, there were some French colonies, and some of these French colonies, I don't want to say provided, but let's say some African enlisted in the French army. And so there have been Africans fighting in the French forces since the 17th century. And in the records, you can find one only. Maybe there's more, they're just not written down. And very often in these records, it's very vague. But there is one Black soldier known who was called Jean-Baptiste Pandois, who actually was a musician. But the French soldiers or the French officers could not recruit Black soldiers in North America. They had received explicit orders that they were there as an ally of the Americans, but they're not there to recruit other soldiers. So those that were already part of the French army might have joined, but that's about it. But of course, it has to be said that the French, when they arrived in Newport, some of them got black servants that they would pay, of course, not a lot, but they would pay them to be their servants. There's a few accounts on that, actually. They used also some African-American locals to guide them throughout the lands. Some were translators and so on. So there is, of course, cooperation happening between the French and some African-Americans in Newport. And so we can see here a few of these testimonies on this. So this is Le Comte de Chastellux, who is at the time quite young, as you can see. But so he is observing August 3, 1780. And I'm not sure this is published, but I at least found it in one of the transcriptions lately that I made. But so August 3rd, 1780, so they've just arrived in Newport, and what's going on is that the encampment is being built in Newport. So when the French arrive, of course, they have to build a fortified encampment to protect themselves against eventual, like maybe British attacks. And so what they're doing is constructing this big entrenchments around their encampments, and for that they received the help of the Rhode Island Regiment. And here you can see that he says that the American militia are encamped in 2 lines, and there were a whole post of Negroes and the advanced sentinels of that color with white shirts as they wear in this country. So he is observing immediately that there's a lot of black soldiers serving in this Rhode Island Regiment that is helping them building their encampment. He doesn't comment any more on this, but he just notices that that's the case. And then about the Rhode Island Regiment too, so Chastellux, as I already mentioned, the Major General serving under Rochambeau and on who I have been writing my PhD dissertation, he is writing about the Rhode Island Regiment in his travel diary, describing this moment when there's a passage with the ferry and he met with a detachment of the Rhode Island Regiment, the same corps that we had with us all last summer being in Newport. But they have since then been recruited and closed. And the greatest part of them are Negroes or mulattoes, but they are strong, robust men, and those I have seen have very good appearance. So I think to notice here is the but in the sentence, of course. But again, this describes that there are a lot of African Americans serving in this Rhode Island Regiment. And he also says to his sister in a private letter that is today unpublished, he writes just after Yorktown about the Rhode Island Regiment soldiers again, saying that the vigorous men are eager to combat in the first line of battle, where they show great ferociousness. So he describes their fierce ways of fighting. He also describes other comments. For instance, a Negro on horseback came on full gallop and to let us know about the arrival of someone that he's describing. So they sometimes come with messages over to the encampment in Newport. And then there's also a whole anecdote with a canoe that they have to traverse this river. I don't have to explain that, but he does explain that the specific canoe, they had to transport a few people, amongst whom a Negro armed with a paddle instead of an oar. So you can just see by these testimonies, they don't tell you that much, as you can see, about how it all was organized or anything, but they do just make little comments where you can see that in daily life, the French soldiers were working together with African-American soldiers. And you can see that too here in Blanchard, another French officer that wrote, as you can see, the Journal de Campagne. And he says too, for instance, on apparently the Transatlantic Journal already, they did lose a domestic Negro on board. So apparently meaning that they had one on board, which should require more research what that really means. But there was apparently an African-American or African domestic person that was apparently on that ship. And then he also says in a more little light kind of fun description, he says, in Newport, during dinner, we toasted several times to the King of France. And this affected everybody, as when I walked by a room where domestic Negroes were drinking, I heard that they were also toasting on the health of the king. And then same to when they go to Yorktown, there was a guide that accompanied them that was also of African-American descent. So again, just another example of the fact that in the French journals, you can find these clues of the fact that African-Americans were participating in the war effort. And one of the most famous quotes is right here, is from von Closen, that's quoted very often in relation to the Rhode Island Regiment again, when you can see here 3/4 of the 1st Rhode Island Regiment consist of Negroes. 3/4, just to realize that's a lot. And the regiment is the most neatly dressed, the best under arms, and the most precise in maneuvering. So on top of it all, there is compliments to the way they are trained and they are performing their military duties. And so this number is often quoted as being the number of kind of the entire regiment, but of course it's just a moment in time where he is describing this. And as you know, in the American Army, the numbers fluctuate over the months and over the years. But still, it's an interesting impression of the fact that there were a very large regiment. And so to go a bit further on this Rhode Island Regiment, because you might just wonder, what is this regiment? It was actually that during the first year of 1775, so when George Washington was appointed general, there was sort of a agreement that they should not employ African Americans or even Native Americans in the army because of just problems that could relate to that, or the problems especially, and this is of course for our today modern perspective terrible, but the fact you would arm African Americans and especially enslaved could lead to terrible insurrection. So there was a real fear of making them important actors within the war effort. But after 2 years or 1 or 2 years, of course, George Washington and his staff started to realize they just really needed men. So they abandoned this fear, but also their problems with the employing African Americans. And so they started to actually do this. And specifically in Rhode Island, you can see here, General James Barnum proposed to combine the Rhode Island Regiment, and especially to include a Black battalion. And he says that that can be easily raised there. And so you can see in these muster rules, which are important sources as well, but often they don't mention the color of skin, but sometimes here they actually do. And so you can see that it does name members of an all-Black battalion here in Rhode Island. And so they were participating in a lot of battles and played actually a very important role in the war, such as the Battle of Long Island, Red Bank, Rhode Island, Pines Bridge, and of course, to see the Siege of Yorktown. But these are the American sources, but it's just important for us to realize, of course, that there were integrated regiments and units. They were serving as soldiers, but also as support staff, such as cooks, laborers, craftsmen, drummers, flag bearers, couriers, medical assistants. And they were both free and enlisted. And free and enslaved is what I wanted to say there. And some of the enslaved fled from their masters. Some were promised liberty after the war, which is a very painful story, because it's true that they were promised liberty, but often they never actually got that. But there are stories of enslaved that ran away to join the army, and then with the pay they received, they could buy their own freedom. So it's a very complex story, which I can address in questions, but I want to move forward to the next point. And what's also important to remember, of course, is that there were, of course, these soldiers and people really engaged in actual warfare, but there were also quite a lot of African-American spies, but also these other occupancies that I already said. But what's also important to realize is that, of course, supplies for the army were often based on slave labor. So even if there's not direct involvement in the war effort as for their fighting in the army, of course, if you have food, how is the food produced? How is cotton produced for the different clothes and so on? So it's even way broader than just the army itself. So to come back to the French description, you can also see another description of the same von Closen saying that 1/4 of the American army is Black. So that would be, at the time he's describing this, being on the road to Yorktown, that about from the 6,000 soldiers that the Continental Army has, about 1,200 to 1,500 men are African American. This is, again, one of these moments. So the numbers are very complicated, as I will show at the next slide. But it is important to mention too, is that during this period, there was a real integration of the army units. They were fighting African Americans were fighting alongside white soldiers. And so you could say that it's the integration that would not be achieved up until the Korean War after this. So it's not for the right reasons, maybe, if you want to think about why, but at least it was this combined effort here. Then one of the most complicated things to do is to give a very good estimate of numbers, and it might require a few years of research with a large team of researchers to really find out the exact numbers, even if I would say it's quite impossible because the sources are really lacking. However, you can of course do some estimates, but there's lots of different estimates, and a lot of people, like a lot of historians would say it's about 5%, some others would say 10 to 15%. Some others would say 25, because there was this whole thing about the 1/4, which von Closen said. But then, of course, the enlistment periods were short, so it depends on the moment you look at. It depends on many factors. So it would require a lot of work that has not been done yet on the numbers, and to understand much more about these forgotten heroes of the American Revolution. And one of the, of course, to end on this specific part of the lecture, of course, Yorktown was the site of the Battle of Yorktown, of course, but it was also a place where there was quite some, well, massacre, because, of course, it's a battlefield. And so you could say that most of those that actually died were Black. And so you could see here in Georg Daniel Schloor's journal saying that corpses are lying about that had not been buried. The larger part of these were Morin, and Morin is a Moor, and it's from a German term, but it means Black. So this is of course a combination of the Black Hessians, the Germans that were fighting in the British side, or even in the French side, Black Frenchmen participating in the French war efforts, Black Englishmen, Black Americans. So this is just all to say that there's of course a larger group all participating and of course sacrificing their life for the cause that was not necessarily their cause, or not the cause for their own liberties at least. A few got their liberties after the war, but of course not many. And one thing that I want to mention before going on to the Native American side, which is less long because there's less material, but French observations, just not to forget, is that a lot of the French officers were commenting on slavery, like the actual institution of slavery, and not all of them were condemning it. Of course, we have to remember that the French were also part of a large empire with a lot of slavery involved, in slave trade, involved in their economy based on slave labor. And some of the French that are in America during the American Revolution start to think more about this, let's say, institution, because when they're in France, they don't really comment on it, or they're actually pro-slavery. And some of them change over time by seeing what they can actually observe in America being the actual slave labor, that of course is very shocking to see if you have never seen it before. And then what you see very often, this is just one example, but they're comparing different states, different islands, and the way the enslaved are treated. And this is, of course, very shocking to hear, I would say, today, because it's like they're treated mildly, and they're, so here you can see they're supported on the same kind of food than their masters. But then he says, even if the earth which they cultivate is moistened with their sweat, it has never been known to blush with their blood. So he here is describing different states of America and comparing them, and saying that some states treat enslaved better than others. And this is just one example of one person called Abbé Robin, but there's many of these where they're comparing and saying, oh, well, there they treat them quite well, and there they don't, and so on. But others do actually really condemn it. For instance, Mathieu Dumas says that there's really the horrors of slavery. And so he went to a public sale of Negroes, and he calls that the market of the underworld. And he described the horrors that he sees there, and how inhumane it is, and the sort of the problems with human nature and slavery. And you can also see that here with Brissot de Varville, who becomes quite an important French revolutionary, but he's also comparing the lives of free Blacks and the lives of the enslaved, and is really condemning slavery as a system. But I just wanted to tell this as sort of an extra. It's not really about the soldiers of the Continental Army, but at least it really also shows you that there's different sides, and some were pro-slavery, some were anti-slavery, some were really in the middle of it all, preaching, for instance, gradual abolition. But all these ideas are circulating, and of course, not all are positive at all. Okay, so if we go further to other forgotten people, and so especially in Newport, there's also the Native Americans' role in the American Revolution. And again, I'm not here to tell you the entire story of the Native American participation, because of course there's really no place for that in the few minutes I have left. But what is important is that, of course, there were a few of the of Native American tribes that actually joined the efforts of George Washington. And they were not necessarily directly involved in specific regiments. Some were, but some were really just doing sort of missions there. And specifically the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras have a particular claim to attention and kindness for their perseverance and fidelity, according to George Washington at the beginning of the war. And so there is a whole letter to Congress that he is explaining that instead of not having Native Americans participating in the war, because of course in the war before that it had caused a lot of different alliances and changes of alliances and lots of, let's say, complicated things to deal with. So they George Washington still wanted to prevent the enemies from securing their friendship. So by having the British not going to get their alliance, but they would do it, and they would be an infinitive service in annoying and harassing them. And so there was a sort of a policy or a idea there to actually get Native Americans involved in the warfare. And so what happens is that specifically, as I've said, the Oneidas and the Tuscaroras were important in Washington's eyes. And so this is a part of the Iroquois Confederacy. And part of these Native American tribes, being actually around 20 of them, not 20 tribes, but 20 representatives of them, go to the French when they arrive in Newport in August 1780. So the French had arrived a month before that. And so there's a delegation of Native Americans coming to Rochambeau in the French camp, where they say that they want to sort of start an alliance with them and that they want to join the cause at the side of course, the Americans, but also the French, as they're now their allies. And so you can see here in a quote, the deputies of the four nations had come to make sure of our arrival and to offer us their alliance. Rochambeau has to refuse this. On strict orders of the French king, he was not allowed to start an alliance with Native Americans because of the previous war that was forbidden. But still, Rochambeau honored them by giving them medallions of the King Louis XVI, different symbols of France, but also sabers, white cloth, and red paint to show that they're actually the friendships, to show respect, and so on. And what's interesting is that this specific scene is described quite often in the French journals. And I think it's not that much known, of course, to a few that have actually read this, but the fact that these Native American representatives came to the French to offer their alliance, and they stayed for a few days actually in Newport, and the French were doing drilling exercises, doing parades and so on in front of these Native Americans. And then in return, there was also a few of the more traditional dances and performances that the Native Americans did to the French. And these are described in quite a lot actually, of the travel diaries. And here there's an example where you can see sort of this anthropological observations of the Native American representatives and what they wear, how they are dancing in wondrous way, always in one place, and that they're painted in various colors, that they have dyed hair all red and adorned it with lots of feathers, and that they've danced for an hour, and then some of them repainted themselves in other colors and so on. So you can really see at least intrigue of this specific person called Daniel Floor, again, the same that already has been quoted, which is a description that is kind of more, I wouldn't necessarily say positive, but at least it shows actual curiosity and interest. Some other Frenchmen are describing this as disgusting dances and very primitive people. So it's again something to say the French are observers, but it's not that they're neutral. They have opinions, and they're sometimes quite shocking to us today, but it does represent the mindset of people that are thinking that African Americans are savages that you do not want to be involved with at the time. Rochambeau, for instance, in his journal, does describe a few acts of Native Americans before they arrived, before the French arrived. And so he does say that, for instance, here, the British were attacked by Indians and that was actually dangerous, but also that the chiefs of Indians had been lost during a specific battle that were known for their bravery. And then he also describes in other points desertion of Native American allies out of the Continental Army and cruel deeds that they performed. So there's always judgment, there's always a negative sort of savage image of Native Americans also, but at the same time, well, just again, it's a sort of a testimony of the fact that there were Native Americans involved. And this leads me also to the last part, being women, because you can see here in one of the diaries that, so you can see, well, not going through the whole slide, but you can see that there's this Indian killing 9 of the enemy, and that also his son killed 2 with his knife, and then on a horseback with his by his side with pistols, his wife is fighting at the same time as well. So a woman is involved, Native American woman, in the specific battle in 1777. But so women are, of course, also one of these actors in the war that have been very often overlooked. And it's, of course, they're not soldiers. Maybe there's a few of these examples where women dressed up as men and joined. But overall, of course, what are women? What is their role? And as for in the French army, there was one woman that has been officially written down, that there was one woman aboard the ships in the Regiment de Pont. And so she was selling food to soldiers on board as what you call a vivandier. But this was a very rare exception. And it's also probably that she was married to someone that she kind of just came along, because there was a real superstition for bringing women along on board of ships. So no French women came with all these soldiers, but of course they did meet them. So to end with this, of course, in Newport, a lot of the French officers met the women of Newport. And one of them, I think, is really interesting, called Anne Vernon, that is meeting Chastellux in August of 1780. And she writes letters to him that are unpublished today. But she says, if ever it becomes customary for ladies to serve as aides-de-camps, I shall certainly solicit for a place with you. And may I expect to gain it, I fear so great a number will apply that I shall be excluded. So this is actually very interesting, because you can here see that women obviously were excluded from any type of military rank, or even joining whatever in the army. But you can see that she is thinking here, if ever I could be an aide-de-camp, I want to be yours, which is also because she is clearly at least very attracted to Chastellux, and they continue to correspond for actually a few years up until she gets married to someone else. But you can see that out of this romantic idea, there might also actually be something more here that a woman wants to kind of join. But what's especially happening, and this is maybe unfortunate for the stories, because you might expect heroic stories about women, but mainly in the French diaries, you can just see that they're observing the ladies of Newport. And Flore is saying here that they're always dressed like noble women, and they are the prettiest among all foreign nations, but they are not haughty and talk to anyone, rich or poor. So there's this equality that he likes about this. And then Chastellux goes even a bit further by saying she had no objections to being looked at, having her beauty commended, or even receiving a few caresses, provided it was without any appearance of familiarity of wantonness. American women never engage in licentious manners. So these are just 2 examples of many other descriptions of women and how beautiful they are or not in the writings of the French. But of course, you can also sometimes read just a few sentences on the way that women provided some supplies, that they were doing like washing clothes, like there were actually people washing clothes in the French army, but officers often engaged women of Newport to wash their uniforms. There was some cooking, there were some nurses, there were some spies, and of course, also important were the social events organized by women in Newport, such as dinners where they had conversation and where exchanges took place between the French and Americans. And just one example here out of the Diary of Chastellux again, which is that Sarah Franklin Bache, so being Benjamin Franklin's daughter, was actually very involved in the army in her own way. And so she shows the room filled with 2,200 linen shirts that were for the soldiers of Pennsylvania. And so Chastellux was very surprised because he could see that the Philadelphia ladies had bought the fabric and cut and sewn the garments themselves. It was an initiative of the women of Philadelphia to provide these shirts to the soldiers of their state. So just a few examples, but of course we have to remember that also women, even if they were not directly engaged, were participating in the war efforts in their own ways. And so all this is to say that there's of course this ongoing revolution up until the actual end of the American War of Independence, with of course this struggle for independence and also struggle for emancipation that was not ended with 1783 peace agreements, but that is maybe still continuing today. And one of the things we should do is look more maybe at French sources to identify many of these unknown stories. And I've just touched upon a small layer of what should be done and what can be done, because I would say a lot of more research is needed to be done to let's say, let these people speak, but also the French sources that can give much more information. And there's a lot still out there. As I've used quite a lot of course, published sources, but also a few unpublished ones. And the moment I started to dig to find a few of them, I found quite a lot. So I would say it requires a new research project here to really dig into this subject and to understand it all better. So thank you very much. I think there will be some questions now.
Yes, thank you, Iris. I'm going to take a look. The first question was regarding whether you had seen documented cases where soldiers of the 1st Regiment, Black members of the 1st Regiment, had not received their freedom once they were finished their service. This was answered to some degree by Robert Sealing in the chat, who suggests that the Recruitment Act of 1778 stipulated specifically that people would be free, but the act itself was an emergency law and was repealed that same year, and enlistments after that date had different rules. And so I think the suggestion is that while enslaved Africans were encouraged to enlist and were offered freedom, it was not a particularly long-lasting offer.
Okay, interesting. But I have heard, like, if you start digging into that subject a little bit, it's there's this promise of freedom, and then you can find a few that are actually free and a few that are not, and a few that are sort of kidnapped again by their masters, and some that have to return themselves. So it's very complex, and it would really require, at least from my side, much more research. And I would be very happy if someone can tell me what to really do there. But it would be so interesting to get numbers on who was indeed free, who escaped, who stayed, who had to go back, and so on. It's just very interesting to see what happens afterwards, because the freedom was promised, and it's the same in the British Army, where freedom was promised, and then some got land, some not, and so on. It's yeah, very interesting. But I'm not sure I really the question. I'm very sorry, but
no, it's. I think the answer is that this is not a well-documented area of research. Yeah. We as a historical society are looking through our archives and looking for examples of people of African and Native heritage, and finding, like you did, Iris, that there's way more in there than people realize, but they just weren't looking for it. But we have seen examples of people who enlisted, Black people who enlisted in Newport with the expectation that they might get their freedom, or free Blacks who expected to get military pensions and who were the subject of some discrimination afterwards, suing for their pensions, not getting it. We're starting to find examples of that too.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, true. And I'm just reading here, Bob Seelig is saying this about the Recruitment Act of 1778. Mm-hmm. And that so that they kind of are free. And then it also says, so it kind of promises freedom, but then just a few months later where it's repealed, and then enlistment after the date are under different rules. So
Yes.
it's more complex than you even imagine, because it's not just individuals, but it's even the rules change over the months. So yeah, it does really require interesting.
So here's another question. Do you know what the response of Chastellux to Anne Vernon was? Her flirtatious offer to serve as his aide-de-camp?
Yes, I have never found the letters, and I would love to come to Newport and find if they're somewhere hidden. Like, I never found the letters from Chastellux, but seeing the replies afterwards, they stay in this flirtatious, fun discussion. So I would imagine that he had replied in a fun way, as he is like the letters. He's, you could say, quite good with women in other letters too. So I can imagine he would just be flattering her a lot and saying, "Of course, I would have chosen you out of all the others." But I have to say, unfortunately, afterwards, he seems to also be writing to another woman from Newport. And then both, like, this is really maybe something for another lecture, but it's really just funny to see, because she gets mad at him because he's writing to someone else and has promised something. And it's one of these, yeah, it's very French. Let's just say that.
I think very 18th century as well.
Yes, for sure. Thank you.
Thank you, Iris. Look forward to seeing you when you come to Newport. Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye-bye.